Well, as you know, a lot of people have been thinking about how to change engineering education for the past 20 years, really. And the question is, how can we change engineering education in a way that actually results in engineers who are better prepared to meet the needs of this 21st century that we're in? A lot of that conversation over the last 20 years has focused really on questions of how we teach and what we teach. And both of those are very important questions. But as Dave and I looked at our own experiences at Olin, at the University of Illinois, and at experiences at other places around the world, we found that what was really missing from that conversation was a conversation about culture and sort of underlying values, which we think are really critical in terms of developing the kinds of experiences that students need in order to develop as whole new engineers, and also in order to change engineering education in a way that will actually stick. I think one of the things that's interesting about the conversation around engineering and science and technology in the US is the extent to which, in a lot of cases, we've placed the blame for a problem exclusively on the shoulders of students, right? And so you look at all the calls in industry and the calls from the government for we need more students in engineering education, we need to produce more scientists and more engineers. And the approach has largely been one that says, if we could just get more students in the door, then we would solve the problem. And I think the point that Dave and I want to make is actually half of the problem might be around getting people in the door, but half of the problem has to do with what is actually behind that door, what the culture is that's present, what the experience is of being an engineering student today. And we thought it was really important to acknowledge that issue and to paint a sort of positive picture of how we might change culture in engineering education in a way that actually makes students excited about doing engineering, in a way that makes them sort of look forward to continuing with their studies and then continuing to go out in the world and change the world, as opposed to viewing engineering education as sort of a 4-year slog that they have to get through in the hopes of eventually getting a reasonably well-paying job at the end. One of the really interesting things for us in writing this book was the extent to which, in writing the book, we kept sort of peeling back layers of the onion and finding there was something that was more fundamental than the initial framing that we'd thought of. And that in many ways corresponds to our own sort of journey of discovery over the last decade in starting Olin and working at Illinois, how we sort of started by asking the question, okay, what should we change about the way we teach? Oh, we ought to do project-based education. What should we change about what we're teaching? We ought to put more emphasis on communication skills, to much more of a sort of culture underlying values-based sort of orientation where we say, yeah, it's all important what we teach and how we teach, but if we don't actually change that sort of cultural immune system that underlies those things, those sort of superficial, superstructure level changes are not actually going to stick. So for us in writing the book, it was very interesting how at various points we felt like, okay, now we've got the formulation that's actually the core formulation, and then we dig a little deeper and find that there was something underneath that. And I feel like where we got to with respect to identifying these sort of core underlying pillars for a new kind of engineering education is pretty fundamental and is not something that we had in mind when we started the process of writing this book. I mean, another sort of interesting thing to us in doing this writing was the extent to which we did a lot of digging in spaces outside of engineering education, whether in educational psychology or in sort of change management literature, more from the sort of business side of things. And one of the really striking things for us in learning about these different literatures was the extent to which these are ideas that are pretty well known in other parts of the world that haven't really penetrated into engineering education. So I think a lot of what we learned in writing the book are some ideas that are really powerful ideas that have been applied elsewhere and that are pretty ripe for application to engineering education. I think the book actually is for a lot of people, and that's one of the things we were thinking about in writing the book. If you think about the conversations that have happened around changing engineering education, in a lot of cases those conversations are limited to a relatively small number of faculty members who are passionate about engineering education. We tried to write the book in a very sort of accessible, anecdote-driven way, which makes it accessible to everyone from a high school student who might be interested in figuring out where to go to college and what they should be looking for in college, to a CEO who's interested in understanding what some of the directions are that engineering education might want to move. So our hope is that this is a book that a lot of people can read because it's not a book that's filled with a lot of jargon. It's a book that's filled with what we think are some pretty interesting stories, but interesting stories that we think have some important lessons attached to them. I think one lesson learned from the Olin experience is actually you don't need $500 million to do something really cool and exciting. When Olin started out and we were doing some interesting things, and we go to an education conference and talk to people, everyone would nod and say, that's really interesting, and if I had $500 million, I could do something really cool too. But as we sort of went through the process of writing the book and looked not only at what was happening at Olin, but also happening around the world, the things that were common were not things that you need lots of money to implement. Rather, they're things that require you to actually question some of your cultural values. So I think a really important lesson learned at Olin is that it's the culture, not the curriculum. And we think that that lesson is a lesson that's portable to lots of other environments. I think another really important lesson at Olin is a lesson around what you might call effectuation, the willingness to take a step even when you don't know exactly what the answer is going to be, and be reflective about what possibilities that step opens up for you. Certainly the story of Olin, as told in the book, is one where lots of things go wrong. And those things that go wrong end up being real opportunities for exciting things to happen. And so I think in changing engineering education, we maybe as a community need to be more willing to sort of take a risk and leap into something without actually knowing that all the data is there to support that step, because sometimes you only learn things by trying them out first and then reflecting on what didn't work. You know, I think there's an interesting story in the book about Honda, the guy who started the Honda Motor Company, and the sort of the joy framing in some ways comes from his writing about the sort of joy of engineering and the joy of creating a product that really responds to the customer's needs. I think traditional engineers who are actually engaged in real engineering and doing real stuff that they're excited about doing, they recognize that what they're doing is joyful, and they recognize that what they're doing requires taking risks and having courage. And they recognize that what they're doing requires being sort of open to possibilities that they maybe haven't recognized before. So I think actually people who are engaged authentically in engineering are going to be pretty receptive to the message in this book. I think what people are maybe not going to be as receptive to is the idea that we ought to change engineering education away from the way that it has been. And the reason that people might not be receptive to that is sort of the same reason that hazing sticks around in fraternities, right? I went through it, and therefore you should go through it. And so I think in talking about changing engineering education, it is important to acknowledge that there's a culture within engineering education, and that culture in too many places is a culture that says this is something you suffer through for 4 years in order to get to the good stuff at the end. And what we're saying is no, it doesn't actually have to be suffering. It can be good, hard fun. It can be joyful, and can be something that you're actually engaged with in a collaborative way with your colleagues, and be working hard and learning stuff, but at the same time be excited about what you're doing. And so I think I have not heard a lot of pushback from people who are actually doing engineering. I think you do hear pushback from some academics who are sort of subscribed to it was hard and painful for me, therefore it should be hard and painful for you philosophy.